Hey there and welcome back to the channel. I know you clicked on this video because you re-curious about one of the darkest chapters in military history, chemical weapons in World War I, and I get it. You've probably seen those haunting images of soldiers in gas masks, maybe watched some Hollywood depictions. But let me tell you something. The reality was far worse than anything you've seen on screen. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a young soldier in 1915, sitting in a trench somewhere in Belgium. You've been dealing with machine gun fire, artillery shells, the constant threat of snipers. You think you've seen the worst of what war can offer? Then suddenly, you see something that makes your blood run cold. A yellowish-green cloud slowly drifting across no man's land, toward your position. That's chlorine gas, and you're about to experience a new kind of hell that humanity had never unleashed before. You might be wondering, how did we even get to this point? How did civilized nations decide to weaponize chemistry itself? Well, let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare. When World War I started in 1914, military leaders on both sides expected it to be over by Christmas. They were thinking in terms of traditional warfare, cavalry charges, rifle volleys, maybe some artillery. Nobody was prepared for the industrial-scale slaughter that was about to unfold. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Chemical weapons were actually invented for World War I. The first recorded use of toxic gases in warfare goes back to ancient times. The thing is, by 1914, we had the industrial capacity and scientific knowledge to produce these weapons on a massive scale. And when the war bogged down into trench warfare with millions of men facing each other across a few hundred yards of cratered earth, military commanders became desperate for anything that could break the stalemate. Now, you've probably heard that Germany was the first to use chemical weapons in WWI, and that's technically true for large-scale deployment. But let me give you the full picture here. Both sides had been experimenting with tear gas and irritants since late 1914. The French actually used tear gas grenades first, and the Germans responded with their own irritant chemicals. But these early attempts were more about causing temporary discomfort than mass casualties. The real game changer came on April 22, 1915. At the Second Battle of Ypres, I want you to picture this scene, because it's important you understand just how unprecedented this moment was. German forces had installed over 5,700 cylinders containing 168 tons of chlorine gas along a 4-mile front. At 5 p.m., they opened the valves and let the wind carry this green death cloud toward the Allied lines. The French and Canadian troops in the path of this attack had no idea what they were looking at. Remember, this had never happened before in modern warfare. Some soldiers actually thought it was a smokescreen and weren't immediately alarmed. Within minutes, men were choking, gasping for air, their lungs burning as if they were on fire from the inside. The chlorine gas reacted with the moisture in their respiratory systems, creating hydrochloric acid. Yes, you heard that right. Their own lungs were being dissolved by acid. Here's something that really gets to me about this first major gas attack. The Germans themselves were unfully prepared for how effective it would be. They watched as thousands of Allied soldiers fled in panic, leaving a gap in the line several miles wide. But they hadn't positioned enough troops to exploit this breakthrough, because they were unsure the gas would work. It was both a tactical success and a strategic failure that would haunt both sides for years to come. You might be thinking, okay, so chlorine was bad, but surely they developed defenses quickly, right? Well, yes and no. The immediate response was crude but somewhat effective. Soldiers were told to urinate on cloth and hold it over their faces, because the ammonia in urine could neutralize some of the chlorine. Can you imagine being so desperate that pissing on a rag becomes a life-saving technique? But this was just the beginning of an escalating chemical arms race that would define the rest of the war. Let me tell you about phosgene, because this is where things get really sinister. By late 1915, both sides realized that chlorine had serious limitations. It was visible, it was affected by wind conditions, and soldiers could sometimes detect it in time to take precautions. So German chemists developed phosgene, which was colorless and nearly odorless. It had a faint smell that some described as musty hay or new-mown grass. Imagine that. Something that smelled like a peaceful summer day could kill you in minutes. But here says the truly terrifying thing about phosgene. It could cause what S called dry land drowning. The gas would damage the lung tissue so severely that fluid would build up, and victims would essentially drown in their own bodily fluids hours or even days after exposure. You could walk away from a gas attack feeling relatively fine, only to collapse and die 24 hours later as your lungs filled with fluid. The psychological impact of this delayed death was enormous. Soldiers never knew if that slight cough or shortness of breath was just fatigue or the beginning of their death sentence. Now, I want to address something you might have heard, that gas attacks were actually that effective in terms of casualties. Some historians point out that gas only accounted for about 3% of total WWI deaths. But this statistic misses the point entirely. The real weapon wasn't just the gas itself. It was terror. Gas attacks forced soldiers to fight while wearing masks that restricted their vision and breathing. It made every breeze suspicious, every strange smell potentially deadly. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps more effective than the physical casualties. And speaking of gas masks, let me paint you a picture of what it was like to wear these things. The early masks were basically cloth bags soaked in chemicals, with glass or mica eyepieces that fogged up constantly. Try to imagine fighting for your life while breathing through layers of chemically treated fabric. With your vision obscured by condensation, unable to communicate clearly with your fellow soldiers, many troops said they'd rather take their chances with the gas than fight while wearing the masks. But we haven't even gotten to the worst one yet. In 1917, the Germans introduced what they called Gelb Crews, Yellow Cross artillery shells. These contained mustard gas, and this stuff was in a league of its own. Unlike chlorine or phosgen, which primarily attacked the respiratory system, mustard gas was a blistering agent that attacked every part of the body it touched. It could penetrate clothing, leather, even rubber. Soldiers would be covered in painful blisters from head to toe, their eyes swollen shut, their throats burned raw. Here's what really gets me about mustard gas. It was persistent. While chlorine and phosgene would dissipate relatively quickly, mustard gas could contaminate an area for weeks or even months. Soldiers would unknowingly walk through contaminated ground and suffer burns on their feet and legs through their boots. The stuff was so insidious that it could remain dangerous in shell craters and abandoned trenches long after the battle was over. Now, you might be wondering about the human cost of all this chemical warfare. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had caused over 1 million casualties, with about 90,000 deaths directly attributable to gas attacks. But these numbers don't tell the whole story. Thousands more died from complications years later, their lungs permanently damaged by gas exposure. Veterans would suffer from what we'd now recognize as chemical-induced COPD, emphysema, and various cancers for decades after the war ended. Let me tell you about some of the individual stories, because I think it's important you understand this wasn't just statistics. These were real people. Private William Pressey of the Canadian Corps wrote about a gas attack in 1917. The effect was instantaneous. The men were caught completely by surprise and were overcome before they had a chance to protect themselves. I saw them running about the trench, coughing and gasping for breath. Their faces turned green and blue, frothing at the mouth, and writhing in agony on the ground. These first-hand accounts give you a sense of the absolute terror these weapons created. But here's something that might surprise you. The development of chemical weapons also led to some of the first international cooperation in warfare medicine. Doctors on both sides began sharing information about treating gas casualties, because the effects were so horrific and unprecedented that medical professionals felt a duty to help regardless of which side their patients fought for. It was one of the few bright spots in this dark chapter of human history. You're probably wondering about the ethics of all this, and trust me, people were asking the same questions at the time. The 1899 Hague Convention had actually banned projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. But the major powers found ways to rationalize their use. The Germans argued that releasing gas from cylinders wasn't technically using projectiles. The Allies claimed they were only retaliating against German gas attacks. It was a masterclass in legal sophistry that allowed both sides to ignore international law. Let me address a common misconception you might have heard. Some people think chemical weapons were considered ungentlemanly or against military honor. But that's not entirely accurate. What military leaders actually objected to was the unpredictability of gas weapons. Wind could blow the gas back toward your own troops. Weather conditions could make attacks ineffective. The weapons required specialized training and equipment that many units lacked. The objections were more practical than moral in many cases. The technological development of these weapons was frighteningly rapid. By 1918, both sides were experimenting with what we now call binary chemical weapons, artillery shells that would mix two relatively harmless chemicals upon impact to create deadly compounds. They were working on more efficient delivery systems, more potent chemical combinations, and ways to defeat increasingly sophisticated gas masks. If the war had continued into 1919, we might have seen chemical weapons that would make mustard gas look mild by comparison. But here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of WWI gas attacks: the environmental impact. Millions of tons of chemical agents were produced during the war, and much of it ended up contaminating battlefields across Europe. Even today, nearly a century later, farmers in France and Belgium occasionally uncover old chemical shells while plowing their fields. The soil in some areas remains contaminated, and there are specialists whose job it is to safely dispose of these ancient weapons. The psychological scars went far beyond the battlefields too. Veterans returning home often suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD, but which was then called shell shock or neurasthenia. For many gas attack survivors, certain smells or weather conditions could trigger panic attacks years later. The smell of cleaning chemicals, fog rolling in on a quiet morning, even the scent of freshly cut grass could send a veteran into a spiral of terror as they relived those moments of choking helplessness in the trenches.
Ow!
I want to talk about something that might make you uncomfortable. The scientists who developed these weapons. These weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches in secret laboratories. Many of them were respected chemists who genuinely believed they were serving their countries and maybe even shortening the war by developing more effective weapons. Fritz Haber, the German chemist who pioneered chlorine gas attacks, was later awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on synthesizing ammonia, which revolutionized agriculture and helped feed millions of people. The moral complexity of these individuals is something we're still grappling with today. The irony is that chemical weapons, for all their horror, didn't actually change the outcome of World War I. The war ended much the same way it would have without gas: attacks through attrition, economic exhaustion, and the entry of the United States. All the suffering caused by chemical weapons didn't shorten the conflict or provide any side with a decisive advantage. It just added another layer of horror to an already horrific war. By 1918, both sides had developed increasingly sophisticated defenses against gas attacks. Gas masks had evolved from crude cloth bags to complex devices with multiple filters and better sealing. Artillery tactics had adapted to account for gas-contaminated areas. Soldiers had learned to recognize the signs of different chemical agents and respond appropriately. In some ways, the chemical arms race had reached a kind of equilibrium where neither side could gain a significant advantage through gas attacks alone. But the legacy of WWI chemical weapons extends far beyond that conflict. The techniques and knowledge developed during those 4 years would resurface in World War II, in conflicts throughout the 20th century, and even in modern terrorism. The Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of chemical weapons in warfare, was a direct response to the horrors witnessed during WWI. Yet the protocol had loopholes. It didn't ban the development or stockpiling of chemical weapons, and many countries reserved the right to use them in retaliation. Here's something that might give you chills. During World War II, both the Allies and Axis powers had massive stockpiles of chemical weapons, including agents far more deadly than anything used in WWI. The main reason they weren't used wasn't moral qualms, but fear of retaliation. Each side knew the other could respond in kind, creating a kind of chemical weapon that prevented their use on the battlefield. Well, sadly, this didn't prevent the Nazis from using chemical weapons in their systematic murder of civilians, which was a different kind of horror altogether. The scientific knowledge gained from WWI chemical weapons research also had civilian applications, both beneficial and terrifying. Many of the same compounds used as chemical weapons became the basis for pesticides that revolutionized agriculture. The nerve agents developed during and after WWI research became some of the most effective insecticides ever created. But this dual-use nature of chemical knowledge also meant that the expertise could easily be turned back to weapons development. As we wrap up this dark journey through WWI chemical warfare, I want you to remember that this isn't just history, it's a warning. Yes. The same human ingenuity that can cure diseases and feed the hungry can also create weapons of unimaginable cruelty. The chemists who developed chlorine gas, phosgene, and mustard gas weren't monsters. They were people much like us, working within the context of their time and circumstances. That's perhaps the most frightening lesson of all. The reality of gas attacks in World War I was worse than any movie could portray, more terrifying than any fiction could imagine. It was the moment when humanity crossed a line that we're still struggling to step back from. Every time you hear about chemical weapons being used in modern conflicts, remember that it all traces back to those first green clouds. Drifting across the battlefields of Belgium and France over a century ago, the soldiers who survived these attacks didn't just carry physical scars. They carried the knowledge that human beings could create such weapons, deploy them against other human beings, and justify it as necessary for victory. That knowledge changed how we think about warfare, about science, about the very nature of human conflict. And in many ways, we're still living with the consequences of that first terrible decision to open those gas cylinders and let the wind carry death across no man's land. Thanks for staying with me through this difficult topic. I know it's heavy material, but I think it's important we understand this history, not to glorify it, but to learn from it. If you found this informative, let me know in the comments what other dark historical topics you'd like me to cover. And remember, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.